Okay, now that you are finished with your quiz, we are ready to move on to the next step, and that is talking about science and the scientific method. Biology is a type of science, and what that means, very simply, is that we are going to organize, or science can be defined as an organized way of gathering and analyzing evidence about the natural world. Anything that's science is usually data driven. We have to gather information, we have to analyze that information, and since we are dealing with biology, in most cases it is about the natural world. The goals of science, and in this case the goals of biology, are pretty simple. The first thing we want to do is to be able to provide explanation for events in the natural world. Why do things happen the way they do in the world around us? Second, we want to use these explanations to see if we can find and understand patterns, and then that will allow us to make predictions about future events. Okay? This example of this was getting an understanding of global warming. Okay, and the patterns that we had recognized to do that, and from that we were able to make predictions about what would happen in the future, and then come up with ways to change that for the better. So that is the goal of science. Now, in science, the best way we go about gathering and analyzing that evidence is through a process we call the scientific method. Now, I'm sure in the middle school you guys talked about the scientific method, so we're just going to do a quick review here and go over it in about a day, and then be ready to move on. Okay, you will be having a quiz over the scientific method, so make sure you are paying attention. The first thing you got to do is ask a question. What is it? Do you notice something about the natural world? Okay, and if you do, does that make a question? Okay, or does that cause a question to arise? Once you have a question or a problem you would like to solve, you are probably going to do some form of research to find out a little about it, and once you have gained some knowledge, you are going to form a hypothesis. From there, we're going to design and construct an experiment. During the experiment, we will collect data. Once we have that data collected, we will analyze it. And then finally, once we have analyzed the data, we will be able to draw some conclusions about how to answer or fix our problem. So let's talk quickly about each of these things and get moved on to the next step for today. Now, as I said, the first step is to ask a question. After that, we gather some information. We're able to form a hypothesis. An hypothesis is commonly called an educated guess because if you did your research, you became educated enough to give a scientific explanation. That means it is data-driven hypothesis. Okay, it's not a haphazard guess. And one thing that is very important about all good hypotheses is that they are testable. Okay, if it does not testable, we can't see if our hypothesis is correct. Therefore, it's not really a good hypothesis. So it must be testable. Second, it has to be based on logic. It has to be based on logic. Use inferences. You apply your knowledge to certain situations. It should not be biased. Okay, it should be based on the information that you gathered, not what you want to happen, okay, but it should be based on inferences. Okay, those things are always true. From there, as I said, we have to construct or come up with an experiment. The best type of experiment to use in science is what we call a controlled experiment. In a controlled experiment, there are always two groups. There is the control group and there is the experimental group, and we'll talk about the difference between those as we move along. Now, in order to have your two groups, you're going to have to look at some different variables or factors that can affect the outcome of the experiment. During your experiment, you need to make sure that only one of the variables or one of the factors is affecting the outcome of the experiment. That variable or that factor is called the independent variable. This is the one that you are testing. Now, there is going to be a variable that may change in response, okay, to the variable that you are changing in the experiment. The variable that changes in response is called the dependent variable. In your experiment, the experimental group will receive the independent variable. The control group will be done without that variable in place. Okay, that is very important. Now, the way that a controlled experiment works, and we'll talk about this more as we move through today, is there are multiple variables that can affect the outcome. You are going to control all but one of those variables, hence the name controlled experiment. The only one that will be different between your groups is that single experimental or independent variable. The rest, or the control group, will have all of the same variables. They will all be the same between both the control group and the experimental group. Okay. The reason then that it is called a control group is you can use it for a comparison. After you look at the data from your experimental group, did the variable that you were testing, the independent variable, have any effect on the outcome of the experiment? That's why you have two groups, one with the variable you're testing and the one without. Now, as you are experimenting, it is very important that you observe and record your observations. Usually that information that you record is known as data. There are primarily two types of data. There is quantitative data and there is what we call qualitative data. Make sure that you understand the difference between the two. Quantitative to me is very simple. It means a quantity. That means you're going to assign a number to it. You can see here we're measuring 5 grams, 10 yellow beets, 20 milliliters of water. On the other hand, a qualitative data does not have numbers associated. For example, shape. We said it's round. It has a rough texture. It has a bad odor. There are no numbers assigned here. That is a quality. Round, rough, bad are considered qualities of the substance. So again, make sure you understand the differences. In most cases, especially with quantitative data, we will construct data tables and graphs to represent that data. And that is where we go next. Analyzing the data. The purpose of analyzing the data, as we mentioned earlier, is to try and find patterns in science. Okay, we can do that. We can find these patterns by making tables and constructing charts or graphs. This is an example of a table. There are columns and rows. Okay. From this table, we can see that the yellow is the most prominent number. Okay, in this case, they were simply counting the number of Smarties, a type of candy. We can also turn this table into a graph or chart, in this case, a column graph. Okay, and in this case, we can look at this graph very quickly and realize that soccer is the sport that is played by the most number of students, with basketball being second, football third, swimming fourth, and ice hockey fifth. Okay, so again, the purpose of tables and graphs, it makes it easier to analyze the data and find patterns. once you have analyzed the data, once you have found a pattern within the data, you should be able to draw a conclusion. What does that mean? It means you give meanings to the pattern. What does that pattern tell us? Okay. What changes can we make if we need to? These are the steps of the scientific method. Now, as we move on through today, I'm going to go through with you a paper that you can pull up in your Canvas called the scientific method. Okay. And we will go over that together as a class. And then after you finish that, you will have an assignment. I will explain that assignment in another short video.